हरिः ओम श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ओम। सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम्। Om. Namaste, everyone. This is our first session of Essentials of Dharma, and we'll be covering many topics in the next few modules that will follow. But today we'll be looking at the first topic of establishing identity. But before we get into that, I just wanted to go over some of the sambandha, the relationship between what we are doing and what is going to be accomplished. So we'll take a look at that. But first, we'll, as customary, we'll begin with a Mangalacharan. So this is the first session, Essentials of Dharma, what every Hindu should know. We'll begin with the Mangalacharan. Ratnakara Dhauta Padam Himalaya Kiritinim Brahma Rajarshi Ratnadhyam Vande Bharat Mataram. So over here, several things are established. First, we are, of course, praying to Devi Ji, Bharat Mata. We are also invoking the entire country, Bharat as goddess. And so this is a recurring theme in Hindutva, as you might know very well. And as customary, even our Mangalacharan is being done. So why does one really do a Mangalacharan? The first reason is to successfully complete what one has begun. So since I've begun these set of modules, I hope that it is seen through completion. The second is that so that it may fall into the right hands. And many times knowledge is misused by people, or it ends with people, right? So for instance, if you gain something essential from somebody else, and if it stops there, or if you go ahead and promote it in a fashion which is incorrect, then the knowledge suffers and the entire reason is lost behind it. And the third thing is that this may continue on for several generations. Whatever is being learned, whatever is being taught, whatever is being shared is passed down through the ages, and people continue benefiting from it. So these are the reasons why one would say a Mangalacharan before beginning any work. And in our parampara, it is also said, of course, it might be a slight exaggeration, but just to give the importance of a Mangalacharan, that any book, any work, anything that is ever done without a Mangalacharan should not be written or read. So, oftentimes we'll find textbooks, right? If you go to school or you go to college and you study textbooks, they may not have a Mangalacharan, obviously. They'll have a page of dedications, but there will not be a page invoking Ishvara. And that is fine. In today's context, we cannot really help it. But at least as Hindus, we should be sure that before we start any new work, we should always begin with a prayer, and we should always invoke Ishvara's grace. So that is one thing to always be remembered. Let me just talk about why I started this session. So as many of you might have attended in 2014, towards the end, we covered substantial series of Tattvabodha talks. And this was targeted at Vedanta students. And there are many teachers of Vedanta out there, but I realized that there are very few people who teach the basic concepts of Dharma. And this relates to several things. It could relate to your society, it could relate to your cultural moorings, it could relate to the way you level. So Dharma is something that's essential. It's a prerequisite to Vedanta. It is not a replacement for Vedanta, certainly. But many people put the cart before the horse, and they begin with Vedanta and then they completely forget about Dharma. So since we have amazing teachers out there, Swamini Brahma Pragyanaji is taking a class. We have Swami Paramathanandaji's lectures, recorded online. And there are many teachers of Vedanta, but there are not enough people talking about Dharma. So I've, specifically shared this presentation, invited people who I know are dharmically inclined and who are prone to, follow this path. So, we all know that we've suffered a great deal as a consequence of colonialism, and this began right from the Mughal era. So the Mughals have invaded us and the British has invaded us, but the legacy still continues because we are still mired deep within this colonial inferiority complex which is still there in India today. And this is something that also needs to be addressed. So, slowly as we walk through these different modules, we'll address each problem one by one. And just as, I've written here in the foreword that I've introduced a little character, a skeptic, which looks very much like Einstein. And at the bottom of most pages, he'll be popping up once in a while to ask some tricky questions or, make some comments, and then I'll address it. So it's kind of my way to raise a question and answer it myself. So, I am also keeping all the dedications towards the end, like right in the appendix, because, there are many people I'm indebted to. Just a few would be, of course, Pujya Swamiji, our entire Arsha Vidya Gurukulam Parampara, who have meticulously taught us so many essentials, not just of Vedanta, but even of Dharma. And I'm also indebted to Rajiv Malhotra ji for some of the concepts we'll be covering, such as looking through the world using a dharmic lens, are completely attributed to him. So I'll be giving him credit towards the end, but I can't do that on every page of the presentation. So I just want to make that clear. And Karthik Vaidyanathan ji, who's not here, but I don't even know if he'll be listening, but I learned a great deal through my conversations with him. So I'm truly indebted to him for some of my dharmic understandings. So with that, let's look at the Anubandha Chatushtaya. So, before, it is customary to look at the Anubandha Chatushtaya before you start any pursuit in our tradition. So the Vishaya is a subject matter, the Prayojana is the result, the Adhikari is the qualified aspirant, and the relationship is what you call the Sambandha. So these four things have to be explored before we begin this work. The subject matter is essentially the what. The Prayojana is the result, which is essentially like what for, what is the whole purpose, why are we really here and what is it going to accomplish. The Adhikari is the qualified aspirant. In every discipline that we see in life, there's always a qualified aspirant and somebody who may not be qualified. For instance, just to give a very rudimentary example, if you have to apply to go to IIT or Harvard, you need to be qualified to attend the university, right? It's not that everybody is able to attend just because they apply. There might be some process where there's a system of checks. It might be dependent on your GPA, it might be dependent on your extracurricular activities and so on. So anything that you do in life requires qualifications, and one requires qualifications even for undergoing a quest for dharma and even for studying Vedanta, anything you put in life. So we'll be looking at the Adhikari and the Sambandha, the relationship between the first three. So of course, the Vishaya over here is covering the essentials of Dharma, and there will be a comprehensive set of topics we'll be looking at, which we'll explore on the next page. The Prayojana, of course, the benefit here is going to be a deeper understanding and appreciation of Dharma. It's various expressions and the way it relates to our cultural norms and traditions. So Dharma is something which is all pervasive. It is not limited to, say, your temple activity or your prayer room. Dharma is something which has to pervade every single aspect of one's life, and we'll be understanding Dharma to begin with in detail, and also its various nuances and the ways in which we can help preserve Dharma at a cultural, social, individual level. The Adhikari, and this is certainly important over here. I have specifically filtered out individuals who are interested in more than just, they don't have an academic interest in this. They are actually inspired to live a life of Dharma, and this knowledge should not end with them. They should not be armchair philosophers. They should be motivated to take these ideas outside, generate a larger discourse, and contribute to the cause of Dharma willingly. It should at least hold an important place in your life, and you should be motivated to and driven to uphold the dharmic cause. So a lot of people, and I must make this commentary at the outset, that a lot of Vedantins I know are armchair philosophers. They don't think that it is their responsibility to give back. They neither contribute to the parampara nor do they contribute to the knowledge base. And I want to make a note on that, because at the end of every 3-year session that Pujya Swamiji holds in Arsha Vidya Gurukulam, where Vedanta is taught for 3 years, he makes a commencement speech. Once everything is done, he makes a speech towards the end. And he says that, many of you have come from all walks of life. Some of you are engineers, some of you are doctors, some of you are lawyers, whatever your profession be. You are all now equipped to handle your responsibilities more efficiently, more effectively, right? Because with this firm knowledge of Vedanta, you can really deal with life in a very clear and unhindered manner. But he says that some of you may choose to come back as teachers, some of you may have students of your own, but it would be wrong for anyone not to share what they have learned. And this I stress, because a lot of people gain something but they don't give it back. They don't share it with people, with their family, with their friends. They don't post things online, and that actually bothers me, because then you feel that it's being wasted. So anytime one gains anything good in life, it is a responsibility to give it back, to share and to grow. Because Pujya Swamiji also says that you give and you grow, and through giving there's growth. So I hope that everyone involved here, and I'm sure of that, is going to contribute in a larger way to Dharma, and they will all grow through it. It's not only for other people's sake, but it's for their very own sake. So this defines the Adhikari. and the Sambandha. So, I've tried my best to, gear these modules in such a way that the requisite knowledge of the subject matter of Dharma is well explained, and the format is accessible. It is, I suppose, pleasing to the eye as well, and the hope is for every attendee to emerge as a future leader. But whatever be their position in life, they should be responsible torch bearers of Dharma. That is something that's very essential. So this is the Anubandha Chatushtaya, and this is the purpose of why we are really gathered over here. So are there any questions here before we continue? Like, feel free to just comment. Okay, I'll just move on to our next slide.
Hari Om Prashantji.
Hari Om.
Yeah, I have a question. I always forget what is Chatushtaya. Can you just give a meaning?
Chatushtaya relates to the number 4. So do you remember the Sadhana Chatushtaya, right? The fourfold qualifications of a student of Vedanta. So what are the fourfold qualifications? Vivekaha, Vairagyaha, the Shat Sampatihi and Mumukshutvam. So those are the 4 qualifications that a student needs for the pursuit of Vedanta. Similarly, here the Anubandha Chatushtaya are the 4 relationships. So this, the between the subject matter, the result, the qualified aspirant, and the relationship. So this is kind of like connecting these 4 essential ideas together. So Chatushtaya basically means 4, fourfold. Good question. So let's look at the modules. And I just want to state that I've only worked on the first one so far. The others are work in progress. It's something that I've planned, but I've not begun work on any of them except the first one. But right now, this should be the basic skeleton. It may possibly change in the future. It may remain the same. I'm not entirely sure, but this is what I've planned so far. So today we'll be looking at establishing identity. And, where do we stand at a Vyavaharika level? I'm sure the Vedantins amongst us will say that, yeah, my identity is Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. That's definitely true. But at a Vyavaharika, at a functional, at a Mithya level, we have various identities that we relate to in life. Someone may be a father, someone may be a son, someone may call themselves a Hindu, someone may call themselves something else. So we're going to be looking at our various identities and the roles, and from a Hindu standpoint, where we stand. So this is our first module. And the remaining modules, as I said, are not yet, I've not even begun work on them, but this is the rough idea. The second is lost in translation. Many times we see people use the wrong kinds of words to describe our categories. For example, soul is used in place of Atma, and then you get confused about what to use for Jiva, right? Because we have so many gradations and so many different subtleties in our philosophy. So many times translation not only does injustice, but it actually spreads the wrong message. And as one continues using the wrong words, they get seeped into our cultural memory, and then those words keep getting passed on, and eventually we lose the correct understanding. So I'm going to be exploring the different expressions that we wrongly use, and to also give alternatives or the correct substitute for it. So that will be a very long session. There will be many words I can think of, and we'll explore them in great detail. So there will definitely be a lot of Vedanta involved in the second module. In the third one, we're going to be looking at misconceptions. A lot of people have misconceptions about our traditions. This comes from the outside, it comes from within as well. So I know I've met many Westerners who think that Hindus are devil worshippers, and that they look at a picture of Kali Ma and they get really freaked out, and then they start spreading all sorts of malicious rumors about Hindus being devil worshippers and so on. So we need to address at least those basic things from the Western standpoint. And then there are also many misconceptions within Hinduism itself, or what we call Sanatana Dharma more specifically, such as all paths lead to the same goal and so on. So we are going to be taking each of these, studying them deeply and debunking them wherever applicable. So the third module will be debunking misconceptions from outside and from within. The fourth one, as I credited earlier, is entirely due to Rajiv Malhotra ji and even my friend and mentor Karthik Vaidyanathan ji. So I've gained a lot of insight from my conversations with them and from reading their works and listening to their talks as well. So we'll be looking at the way to reverse the gaze, because we've so far been looking at the world through a westernized lens. All our norms, all our traditions have evolved and steered us towards a Western way of living, a Western way of thinking. So now we'll be reversing the categories and looking at the West from a dharmic perspective. And we'll be seeing how to do that in the fourth module. In the fifth module, and I've actually spoken to Sundarji about this earlier, we'll also be looking at Hindu contributions to the world, and most likely Sundarji would probably be leading this section, and I'll make contributions wherever I can. In the sixth module, we'll be looking at Dharma as a universal order, and I want to walk people through our beautiful cosmos, a journey through the cosmos, looking at everything from the most minuscule of subatomic particles to the grandest scale of the cosmos. And I want to show how everything is upheld by Dharma as the sustaining force. So we'll be looking at, look through the cosmos, we'll be looking at some scientific principles, and we'll be seeing how it is ultimately the very law, the very order, the very rhythm, which is what we call Dharma, which is upholding everything in its place. And that this universe is a meaningful, intelligent cosmos embedded with knowledge. We don't talk about intelligent design as such, but we say the very cosmos itself is embedded with knowledge. The whole Jagat is Ishvara. Jagat did not create Ishvara. Jagat is a manifestation of Ishvara. And in the sixth module, we'll be understanding this manifestation in detail. In the seventh module, we'll be looking at, I'm sure a lot of people know what witch hunting is. So during medieval Europe and even in USA for some time, people used to hunt blasphemers, people who were against the church or who practiced pagan faiths or who did their own forms of worship and rituals. They were hunted as witches, and they were like hung, or they were castrated, or they were like, put on the stake. So we know there's a lot of atrocity from the missionaries for 2 millennia now. And there's also a witch hunt going on for Hindus, and we'll see that we're being attacked from different fronts, from the media, from missionaries, from academia, from the politics, from places such as Bollywood, and so on. So we'll be looking at all of these things in detail, and we'll be describing and defining the problem, because you can't really find a solution until you describe the problem well. I've met a lot of Hindus who are, somewhat reticent about these issues. They say that why should we focus on the negative? But I would refute that view, because unless and until you understand the problem, you cannot find a solution. So it is important that we first define the problem before we come up with a coherent solution for it. In the eighth module, we'll be exploring the new Hindu Renaissance. I use the word restoring a lost heritage. We're not creating anything new. This has been there with us for time immemorial. The traditions we follow, our heritage, our norms, all of these things have been handed down to us, and it is our responsibility to recover them, to bring them back to the full force. And we'll be looking at ways in which we can contribute and ways in which we can make a change. So these are 8 modules I have in mind, and right now I've only done the first one. So are there any thoughts on these so far before we continue on?
No, these are very well laid out modules, so I'm sure we can learn a lot from this and see what ways we can contribute.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, we'll be doing the first one, establishing identity. So I'd like to ask an open question to the group, and I think Sundarji probably knows this like the back of his hand. So if somebody else besides him would like to define Dharma before we begin our first slide, then please give it a shot. Would somebody like to define their understanding of Dharma?
Dharma is the very order of our living. I mean, each person, any human being or plant, animal, everybody has a certain set of activities they have to do with a certain set of rules that they have to follow. It's just the order, and they just have to do it.
Yes, that's a very good way to look at it. Any other contenders? Would somebody say Dharma equals religion?
Your voice is echoing, Prashant.
Yeah, so does anybody think Dharma is the same as religion?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
But I think many people do Dharma.
Sorry?
I was wondering when Gunjanji said that it's not a religion, why do we say Hindu Dharma?
Exactly, and that's a problem, because especially in our Indian culture, this problem has seeped in. They say all dharmas are equal. I think this started during the era of independence, and I think Nehru ji, Mahatma Gandhi ji, all of these people made some statements in good light. They had good intentions, but ultimately they were misled. So, and today even in politics we say that all dharmas have to be treated equally, right? And that is implying that there is something called Christian dharma, there's something called Hindu dharma, there's something called Sikh dharma, and there are like different dharmas, which is obviously not true, because dharma is one. Dharma is one essential coherent force that is upholding all that there is in this universe. So how can there be different dharmas? It's like saying that there are different laws of gravity applicable to different people based on their religion, right? Which obviously is not true. It's applicable to all. So dharma is something which is applicable world over, and it has found its clearest exposition, the clearest understanding, the clearest unfoldment within the Vedic tradition, undoubtedly. And I say this without any reserve. So dharma is a concept that is most beautifully unfolded and practiced within the Vedic parampara, within the Vedic teachings. And it has been misappropriated as a word, and it has come to mean several things. One of the worst translations of dharma is religion. So we'll be looking at what dharma is. First of all, it comes from the Sanskrit dhatu dhr, which means to hold, to sustain in place. This whole jagat is held in its place. Whatever there is has a law that can define it. The very reason that I'm able to do science today is a fascinating thing. It's a miracle. It's magnificent. Imagine that you can write down a law which says E equals mc square, and this applies everywhere, all the time, all around the universe, right? So the fact that you are able to define something, you are able to write a mathematical law for something, tells you only one thing, that the universe is in order and it can be well explained. It is well ordered. So it is that which is holding things in its place. The electron has a role to go around the nucleus, and the proton has a role to exert a positive charge as a convention that we've given it, and everything has its role. The role of space is to hold objects. The role of time is to continue to flow. The role of matter is to exert weight and gravity, right? So everything in this jagat has its role. It's defined. It's well kept in place, and this entirety of things working together is held together by this force of dharma. That is what we call dharma. The very gravitational force is no different from the very laws of karma, right? Both of these are laws. The law of gravity is a law. The law of karma is a law. Dharma, all of these things can be explained through dharma. This is what we call dharma. This is dharma, the natural order. As Soumyaji also touched upon it, it is a natural order. Second is, dharma is not confined to any one aspect of an individual's life. And this is something that we see secularists are trying to really portray, right? That you keep dharma in your pocket, you keep dharma in your temple, you keep it in your home, don't take it outside. And there's a separation of, I'll touch upon this in much greater detail, but secularism is a separation of state and church as it was originally founded. So that is something that does not apply to dharma, because dharma pervades all your activities, right? So it's something that we have to be cognizant of. Third, from the standpoint of dharma, from the standpoint of karma, these are any actions which are upholding the universal order. So as human beings, and I think again, touching upon Soumyaji's point, all animals, all creatures in this world have their own dharma. You cannot fault a cow for eating grass. You cannot fault a lion for eating meat. You cannot do these things, right? This is dharma. You cannot like philosophically explain things to any other creature. You can only have a free will choice over your actions as human beings. So therefore only a human being is accountable for their actions. And so from the standpoint of karma, actions which are upholding this universal order, and things such as ahimsa, parigraha, steya, and all of these samanya dharma and vishesha dharmas, actions which uphold them are dharma from the standpoint of action. Ritam is another word which can be used for dharma as well, which is referring to the cosmic order, the very laws, the things that hold the universe in place. It's also called ritam. Now, when we talk about Sanatana, it is unborn. So, somebody may inquire, is Sanatana Dharma different from Dharma? In fact, no. Dharma is Sanatana, and when we say Sanatana Dharma, it is removing any qualifiers from the word Dharma as to having a beginning in time. So, Sanatana is something that is unborn, it is beginningless. And this Dharma that we know of, that the Vedas teach us, is beginningless. There is no starting point to Dharma. So, any questions here so far before we continue? Or even comments?
This is good.
Okay. So here's our skeptic, as I said. Every once in a while he'll be asking us questions. Isn't dharma equal to religion? And as we discussed, clearly not. So now we'll be looking at who is a Hindu. Any contenders for this? How would you define a Hindu?
There are certain identities. For example, there's a geographic identity. I do not know which dharmic book or history book it is. It says that any area from the Himalayas to the southernmost part of India, and from starting from the Afghanistan to the you know entire this South Asian region is Hindu. That's a geographical identity. There's a there's a dharmika identity also attached to it. So there may be different perspectives to look at.
Yes, that's true. So this is one perspective, which is a regional geographical perspective. So we'll be looking at this here.
And
Now,
also
Kulu-
any person, sorry, also any person who follows Sanatana Dharma would be a Hindu is what I would
Sure,
put it
that is also
across.
applicable. So as we'll see in the slide, the word Hindu has acquired several connotations, and one may use whichever they prefer, I would say at this point, but I'll try to give all the possible connotations that I can think of which are relevant. So the regional, as I see Sundarji's comment, and we'll come up on that as well, and he's correct about that, that kids born in North America cannot be Hindus then, right? Which is obviously not true. So we'll be looking at Hindu differently, a little different from its regional connotation. So of course, colloquially, when we look at the term Hindu, it's used to address followers of the Vedika Darshana, right? People who follow the Vedika school of thoughts, and this could be any sub-school within it. So you could be a Shaiva, you could be a Vaishnava, whatever. So anybody who adheres to the Vedika Darshanas is colloquially called a Hindu. This is one definition that we have of Hindu. There's a verse in a Shastra called the Meru Tantra which gives its meaning as well. And there are several such verses. I was not able to fit it on the same slide, but there are many definitions of Hindus. Clearly, some of them are modern definitions, but they apply nonetheless. Hinani Gunani Dushyati iti Hindu. The one who destroys the baser gunas is a Hindu. So this is a beautiful definition, and we are happy with that. Nothing wrong in it. Now, as Amitji also touched upon, the modern etymology talks about Hindus, and this was defined by the Persians who visited India, I think, more than 2 millennia ago. So the land which is towards the east of the river Sindhu and flanked by the Indian Ocean on all its remaining sides, the people in this land are called Hindus. So this is a regional definition. It is there, it has stuck with us, nothing wrong in it, but we'll be defining it in a more cultural fashion. Now, by the extension of the regional definition, every indigenous person residing in the subcontinent and adhering to its norms is technically a Hindu, irrespective of how they define themselves. So, if we are using Hindu as a regional term, then everybody in this subcontinent, as you put it, would be Hindu. I have serious problems with the word South Asia because in South Asia we are trying to club Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, all of these countries together, and we are trying to show them as one culture. But clearly, the culture of Hindus is very different from the Islamic culture, and we'll come upon that in the future talks as well. So here we see the regional definition. Now, when we talk about Hinduism, it is a word I don't usually prefer, but I have no problems with it either. It's something that has been handed down to us, and now we happily, make do with it. And it's a good functional banner to unite under, especially at a global international level. So, if you are in USA and somebody is asking you what religion do you follow, of course, even the concept of religion completely befuddles me. Like I will explain it in much greater detail later on when we talk about secularism and so on. But I don't consider dharma as religion, first of all. But at least at a communication at an international level, somebody is asking what your religion is, you can't say that, okay, oh, I'm a dharmic person and I follow the Vedas and this and that, because then it creates a lot of problems. Second thing is a lot of people don't understand the, what is a Vaidika Darshana. And therefore you have to use Hinduism as a unifying banner just to function under. So it's fine, it's a word that has been given to us and we accept it for now. But nonetheless, in this presentation and going forward, I will be referring to it as Vedika Darshana because I'm not entirely fond of Hinduism, but I'll make do with it. So this again, we are looking at the regional definition. We see the Sindhu Nadi over here, the Indus River, or I don't know why people change names, but it's Sindhu Nadi. And we see the land towards its east, and as it's going down towards the Himalayas and flanked by the ocean on the other three sides. That's what we call Hindustan. So here's our skeptic again. Are you saying every Indian can classify as a Hindu? And now I give a little bit of a warning, because this page is very heavy on words. And that's because when I send this presentation out, I certainly cannot give a speech along with it. So this will, hopefully aim to resolve some of the confusions and differences that people might have concerning this idea. So if we are using Hindu as a regional indicator, then certainly, the prefix Hindu applies to everyone within the subcontinent, regardless of their religion or whatever. So, but however, to Sundarji's point, and I agree to this, that in today's context, it is more relevant to look at Hindu as a cultural indicator. Culture is something you take with you wherever you go, and the Hindu culture is undoubtedly the single largest contributor to what we term as the Indian culture, regardless of what the elite secularists suggest. So a lot of people say that India is a mishmash of traditions and there is no such intrinsic Hindu-ness to it, right? Whereas I suggest that the largest contributor to what we call the Bharatiya culture has come from Hindus. It has not come from the Mughals, it has not come from the Christians, it has certainly come from the Hindus, and we cannot separate Hindu culture from the Indian culture. So this inherent Indianness or Hindu-ness is what distinguishes an Indian Muslim from an Arabic one, right? In spite of their religion emerging from the Fertile Crescent, or not so fertile that time, but from the desert region, they can still be considered as Indians, and you can identify an Indian Muslim from another Muslim. It's because they are steeped within the Indian Hindu culture. So here I find the Hindu as a cultural indicator far more relevant than a regional indicator. And now, of course, dharma subsumes concepts of both religion and culture, and it cannot be reduced to any one of them without losing its overall meaning. In the previous slides, we looked at the understanding of dharma in a very deep way. And we see that it cannot be translated to only religion. It cannot be translated to only culture. It covers all these concepts and more. So, because of what we see today that's happened in India, and people have treated Hinduism as one religion like many others. Therefore, now we are creating a separation between dharma and state and so on. So this is what you call a reductionist approach. And a reductionist approach of separating the inseparable dharma has worsened this identity crisis we see in Indians today, and this has led to many repercussions which we will see in future slides. And on a tangential note, while Hindus originated from Bharat, the entire world is open to us. We should not solely restrict ourselves to geopolitical labeling. The world and we ourselves have a lot to gain by keeping the torch of Dharma burning in all corners of the globe. At the same time, we must remain alert not to let Dharma get misappropriated by external forces looking to create mischief. It is a delicate balance which can easily be breached, and we will see much more on that in later modules. So I know we've covered a mouthful over here, but any questions or comments?
Prashanti, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to, it's not like a question and a comment. This, you said Hindu, even the Abrahamics living in our India have Hindu culture, but I think it's somewhat fading nowadays.
You are right.
They are more turning to the Western culture, or they won't wear a bindi. Ancient Syrian Christians and all used to do that, and nowadays it is more becoming like more evangelical, and even Muslims also. The education minister in Kerala changed the name of the house of education minister used to be Ganga. And when this Muslim guy became education minister, he changed it, and they refused to light lamps and all because they are terming it as Hindu, and so on. So I think I think it's time we should define Hinduism a little better.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And as you mentioned earlier, there used to be an era when this was not the case, when people were well assimilated into what we call the Hindu Indian culture. But now, because of polarization and because of all these mullahs and because of these padres from their respective churches and mosques, they have been polarizing them to follow and to give more weightage to Arabia or the Vatican, right? So if you look at, I'm probably going to touch upon these issues a little further, just in interest of time. But let's take Ayodhya, the Ayodhya issue. It is, how many Muslims do we find taking interest in the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Itihasas, the Puranas, and so on? Very few, right? It is something that they should essentially be proud of. The Christians, it's something that they should be proud of because it's part of our great Indian heritage. It's great part of our Bharatiya culture. But still, they will distance themselves from this, and they will, attribute their identity to some kind of a Western land, which you are completely right about. So ideally, a Hindu Christian or a Hindu Muslim, from a cultural standpoint, should follow the norms and the cultural attributes of our country. But this is not happening. They are being polarized. They are becoming more extreme. There's a greater distance growing between themselves and what we term as Hindus. So you're certainly right about that. And later on, as we explore some of the mischief that's being created by these missionaries and by the secularists, we'll explore in great detail why this polarity is taking place. So for now, at least, what is stated on this slide is an ideal. It's an ideal situation which we would hope to have. But you're right about that. There is a lot more going on. So
I think even nowadays some people are actually Christian ashrams. We can say they claim to be like accepting Hindu culture, but actually what's going on there is sort of digestion, as said by Rajiv Malhotra.
yeah, they are getting digested into Abrahamism. They're getting digested into the Western culture.
Not like some like we sharing our culture with Buddhists or Jains. It's not like that, but it's more like a digestion, trying to absorb some aspects of our culture and then converting people. So
Yes, you're right about that. Absolutely.
thank you.
So let's look at the next slide. We'll look at the different global faith systems, and we'll classify ourselves from an Indic standpoint, right? So of course, as we know, there are like hundreds of native traditions around the world. But just to keep things plain and simple, we'll be listing the major ones which are like well known at the tip of our tongues, and we'll divide them into three categories. So first category is the Dharmika darshanas. And here we have the Vaidika Darshana, the Jaina Darshana, the Bauddha Darshana, and the Sikh Darshana. So these are the Indic traditions which have evolved. I am wary of the term religion/philosophy, and we'll see why later. But right now I'm going to use the term Darshana. Darshana implies a philosophy, it implies a point of view, it implies a viewpoint, a way to look at things. The second faith system we see, the major faith system, and in many ways cancerous to dharma, are the Abrahamic faiths. And the reason I use the word cancer is because it spreads in an unmitigated fashion. And they have a tendency to proselytize. But it is in the very tenets of Christianity and at least Islam, and I'm not sure about Judaism since they've already become a minority, so they don't have so much of a footprint. But at least in terms of Christianity and Islam, they have it within them that if you go and convert somebody else, then you are secured a place in heaven. So they have a tendency to proselytize, and they have a tendency to like mislead people within the Indian culture. We'll see. We'll come to that later. The third category is the miscellaneous faiths, which I'm like just classifying as like under the miscategory. You have Zoroastrianism, which are the Parsis. The Parsis follow Zoroastrianism. The Shintos is widely practiced in Japan, like the Shintoism. Baha'i religion actually has its stronghold in India, and if you know the Lotus Temple in, I think, the Delhi region, that is a Baha'i worship center. I don't know exactly what their traditions are, but it's kind of like a potpourri of different things. So they treat Muhammad and Jesus and Krishna and everybody as like some kind of a prophet figure. So that's the Baha'i religion. Then you have the shaman practices, the practices of the Native Americans, things which have more or less become marginalized and you don't hear too much about it. And then you have other pagan faiths around the world. So these are kind of like three broad categories. So here's a skeptic with variations even within Dharma. Where do I fit in, right? So where do you fit in? And we'll come to that in the next slide. So having categorized the schools of thought around the world, we'll have to perform two more iterations, and we'll drill down to the Indic darshanas, and then we'll come and look at the Vaidika darshana in specific. So any questions here? Okay. If there are any, like, you can always interrupt. So now we'll be looking at the Indic faith systems. Within the Dharmic and Indic darshanas, we will drill down to two further divisions. The Astika darshanas accept the Vedas as a pramana, as a means of knowledge. The Nastika darshanas do not accept the Vedas as a pramana. So here are the Astika and the Nastika darshanas within India. So as you recall in the previous slide, we looked at a global perspective, and now this is going to give you an Indic perspective. So the Astika darshanas are Uttara Mimamsa, Purva Mimamsa, Samkhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Yoga. And the Nastik darshanas are Jaina, Bauddha, and Charvaka. Now the next one, which we look at, Sikh darshana, I'm not really sure where to place them, because to be honest, they are quite a confused lot. We know that their origins are Vedic, certainly. Their gurus and all used to worship Rama, Krishna, and you know, Ek Omkara and so on. But in recent times, due to political issues, due to being continually brainwashed, they have distanced themselves from the Vedika darshanas, and they treat themselves as more or less Nastik. And they have actually, you know, at some point, some of their gurus decided to create a bridge between like the Vedas and Islam. And in doing so, I believe they have become more or less digested. So I can't really place them in the Astic category, nor can I exactly place them in the Nastic category. So I'm kind of like confused about where they stand. If somebody has a better idea, we can talk about it. But yes. Yeah, Shamakrishna Bhai is correct. Uttara Mimamsa is the same as Vedanta. So here's our skeptic again. I've been told that some darshanas, including the Astika ones, do not include Ishvara in their teachings. And the response is that's correct. So now we'll classify these darshanas into Saishvara and Nileshvara. Any questions here? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So the Saishvara darshanas incorporate Ishvara into their teachings. The Nileshvara darshanas do not accept the concept of Ishvara as we know it. So here are the Dharmic darshanas divided into Saishvara and Nileshvara. The Saishvara darshanas are Uttara Mimamsa, Nyaya darshana, and Yoga darshana. And the Nileshvaras are Purva Mimamsa, the Jaina darshana, the Bauddha darshana, Samkhya, Vaisheshika, and Charvaka. So the skeptic is back again. And sorry, Soumyaji, you have a question?
Yes, Prashant. When you say Ishvara here, no, I think many people also confuse it with Lord Shiva. I don't know how, I don't know, I always had this question, I never asked, but I have seen many people, whenever I have uttered Ishvara, they have kind of related it to Lord Shiva, not, but here in Vedas, we know that Ishvara is above everything, right? So where did that confusion actually get created was my question.
I see. In my experience, you know, Ishvara, of course, here stands for Shaguna Brahma. And, you know, you can also use the word Bhagwan in place of Ishvara. And I don't think it's only reserved for Shiva, because Ishvara has different forms in which you can worship Bhagwan, right? And we've created some of these forms. Some of these forms have been described in the Puranas and the Vedas and so on. So one form that you can worship as Ishvara is the form of Shiva. And Shiva means auspicious, the very meaning of the word. Another form is Vishnu, and then you have Shakti. So you have different schools, right? You have Shaivas, you have Vaishnavas. So of course, if you interact with a Shaiva, then he will say that my Ishvara is Shiva, Shiva is Ishvara. If you go to Vaishnava, he'll say it is Vishnu. If you go to an ISKCONite in specific, he'll say it's Krishna. So different schools of thoughts have different Ishta forms that they have. So yeah, I don't think that is reserved specifically for Shiva. Now, if you are reading the Vishnu Sahasranam, there's one Ishvara Uvacha, right? Shri Ram Ram Rameti Rame Rame. Yes, that is one instance where Ishvara and Shiva are the same. But in other instances, if you read the Bhagavata Puran, if you read the Vishnu Puran and so on, you'll see that Ishvara is equated with Vishnu. So it really depends upon the tradition you're following, I would say.
Okay. Because at least in South, I think, you know, if you say Ishvara, they relate it to Lord Shiva. It's not
depends.
Anybody else.
So, for example, if you are Nayyar, then certainly your Ishta will be Shiva. If you are Nayangar, then your Ishta will be Balaji.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
So
Vishnu,
it
yes.
depends on who you talk to, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. So, now the skeptic is asking a question that can Nireshwara be equated with atheism? And I know some of you can't read the comments because everyone's name is below, but I'll read it out loud. So the response is no, not at all. That's a narrow Abrahamic category and doesn't fit into our schema. As the next page will show, one can be Astika and Nireshwara simultaneously. These beautiful subtleties will be addressed at great length in a different module.
Question.
Yeah.
Quickly speaking about Ishvara and Shiva.
Yeah.
Right? So when we think of Shiva, we say Rudra, Shiva, and Ishvara are pretty much the same. But when it go into the subtler aspects, especially when you read the Saundarya Lahari and all, it becomes clear that there is Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra as one category. Above that you have Ishvara, and above that you have Sadashiva. So Rudra is Saguna Sa Akara, which means he has a form and a quality. Ishvara has Guna but no Akara, Saguna Nirakara. And Sadashiva is Nirguna Nirakara. So these are all subtle differences that comes as you proceed in Vedanta. But for the lay person, in colloquial parlance, they have taken Shiva to be Ishvara.
Yes.
But any Ishvara is a concept that's beyond the world of forms.
Oh, that's very true. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, that is true. Certainly, that Ishvara cannot be placed onto any given form, and yeah, Sundarji's point is extremely valid. Any comments or questions around the other areas? So I just wanted to clarify that Nireshwara is not the same as atheism. It cannot be classified as the same, and it's a different category which we'll explore. So on the next page, we'll see that you can be Astika and Saishwara, or you can be Astika and Nireshwara and so on. Like, there can be different combinations possible. So would somebody like to give it a shot? It's kind of like a quiz section that each of these are schools of thoughts, and are they Astika or are they and are they Saishwara or not? So there are 4 possible combinations, right? You have Astika Saishwara, Astika Nastika. I'm sorry, Astika Nireshwara, Nastika Saishwara, and Nastika Nireshwara. These are the 4 possible combinations.
Can
Yeah, go for it.
Uttaramimamsa is Astika and Sai Ishvara.
Perfect. Next.
Purvamimamsa. Okay, sorry.
No, you go on.
Okay. Purvamimamsa is not Astika but Sai Ishvara. Sorry.
No.
Purvamimamsa is Astika but Nirishwara.
Correct.
Samkhya is Astika but Nirishwara.
Correct.
Nyaya is also Astika. I think Saishwara or that I am not sure.
It is Saishwara.
Thank you. Vaisheshika is Astika and Saishwara.
It is not Saishwara because they believe that everything is composed of Anu and Parmanu, right? These these small atomic particles. I won't use the word atom, but like particles.
So they don't have the concept of Anishwara.
No, they don't have.
Yoga is Astika and Saishwara.
Correct.
Bauddha Darshana is Nastika and Nirishwara.
Correct.
Jaina Darshana and Charvaka Darshana both are Nastika and Nirishwara.
Correct. Very good. So I'm just giving a few footnotes over here, and I think people can't see it again. So Uttar Mimamsa is synonymous to Vedanta, and in the brackets I've put the people who are attributed to solidifying the philosophy or at least categorize it and putting it on paper. So we know that the most definitive place to go for understanding Vedanta would be the Brahma Sutras, and this has been put together by Badarayana, whom we identify also as Vyasa. So Badarayana is identified as Vyasa, so that's one thing. Jaimini is his student, Vyasa's student, who came up with Purva Mimamsa. He didn't come up with it, he put it together in a systematic form. And Samkhya is attributed to Kapila, Nyaya is attributed to Gautama, Vaisheshika is attributed to Kanada Kashyap, Yoga to Patanjali, of course, The Bauddha darshanas have been attributed to Buddha, but then again their philosophies differ, and they say there have been 24 Buddhas as well. So this was the last one. So we don't really know too much about that yet. Jaina Darshana, I've studied it to a certain extent, so I can say that as a second footnote. The third footnote is Jaina Darshana is attributed to the first Tirthankara, Sri Adinath. And in Bauddha Darshana, I've stated there are 4 schools. So they are Mahayana, Yogacara, Shunyavada, and Kshanik Vijnanavada. These are the 4 schools of Buddhism. So any questions around this? Okay.
These 4 schools of Buddhism, do they follow different, what is different in them? I mean, if you know about it.
I know a little bit. Maybe somebody else may know something in more detail. But let me share like what I know. So the 4 schools, Mahayana, Yogacara, Shunyavada, and Kshanik Vijnanavada. I can talk about the last 2. So Shunyavada, just as we say the nature of reality is Purnam, they say it is Shunyam. And there have been certain debates even with Kumarila Bhatti, who was Mandana Mishra's teacher. And he used to debate the Buddhists earlier, and they had, I think he's debated the Shunyavadins as well to a certain extent. And there is a great difference, and which I can elaborate using the deep sleep example, right? So, for instance, the Vaidikas will say that in deep sleep, the awareness, the self, Atma is always there. You are ever shining. The principle of consciousness never stops shining. It is self-luminous. It is Svaprakasha. So it's always there in deep sleep. It's there in all the 3 avasthas. The Shunyavadins will say that no, it's not there in deep sleep. In deep sleep, like you don't exist basically, right? So the nature of reality is nothingness, emptiness, which is best reflected in deep sleep. So that is the Shunyavada argument. I don't want to get into why Vedanta is correct here, but rest assured that it is, because okay, I'll get into that in a different talk. So that is Shunyavada. Now the other one is Kshanika Vijnanavada, which is a school of Buddhism which believe that consciousness is flickering. It's like a flickering thing which comes into existence and it goes out of existence. So that's why it's called Kshanik. Kshanik means momentary. So momentary consciousness. So it flickers in and out of existence. So that is the second school of thought. I don't know too much about Mahayana and Yogacara, but I can tell you more about Jaina Darshana. So Jainism has several schools, out of which 2 of them are major ones. They are Shvetambara and Digambara. So many times you may see certain Jain sadhus, they are dressed completely in white, right? And they walk on the roads and they collect bhiksha. So these are the Shvetambaras. The Digambaras are the ones who walk completely naked. Digambara means wearing the sky as your clothes. So they are dressed as the sky, which is another way to say that you don't wear clothes. And they have a beautiful philosophy around that as well. So these are the 2 main schools of thoughts in Jaina Darshana. The Shvetambaras themselves are divided into several schools. You have like Sthanakvasis, and this is interesting. So we all know that Jainas also worship Vigrahas. I won't use the expression idol worship because I have problems with that as well, and that's how we are portrayed. But we actually, we build Vigrahas and we infuse the principle of Devata into it, and then but we don't localize Ishvara. That's what I'm trying to explain. So anyway, Jainas were also Vigraha worshippers. And during the time of the Mughal era, I think many people know the jizya tax that was applied, right? So if you were a non-Muslim, you had to pay 75% income tax. 75%, that's massive. And therefore you would be very tempted to convert to Islam, right? Because your laws are not in place for everybody, equal laws. So anyway, we all know that the Mughals went around destroying idols because they believe that it is blasphemous to their tradition. And a lot of Hindu temples, most of which were Hindu temples and some of which were also Jain temples, were destroyed and all the idols were broken down. So one sect of Jaina Svetambaras created a sect called Sthanakvasis, which stopped worshipping idols because they were sick and tired of seeing their forms destroyed. And so they decided to worship in a formless fashion. So that's one form called Sthanakvasi. And then you have Terapanthis. So you may have seen certain Jains which wear a cloth over their mouth, right? They cover their mouth. So those are the Terapanthis. So this way there are different gradations in their philosophy, and we can definitely go into greater detail about that as well. So and the Charvakas are basically
sweet talkers, that literally means sweet, the ones who talk sweetly. Okay, today we have the modern version of it, YOLO, you only live once, you have only one life, so eat, drink, be merry, do whatever you want, there is no consequence, there is no karma, there is no rebirth, there's nothing to do in life, do whatever you want. So those are the Charvakas, and today we call them the materialists, in a sense. They are like the rebirth of Charvakas. And so anyway, Uttara Mimamsaka is Vedantins, Purva Mimamsaka are the ones who follow the karma bhaga of the Vedas, solely the karma marga, not the knowledge portion. The Samkhyas are the ones who accept Purusha and Prakriti, and there's a philosophy around that as well. The Nyayas are the logicians. The Vaisheshikas are the ones who come up with the particle theory. I refuse to use the word atom because it has certain connotations, but let's say particles. Yoga, of course, we all know yoga. I should not be explaining that. Bauddha Darshana, Jaina Darshana, Charvaka. So these are the 12 dharmic darshanas which originated in India. So, any thoughts here? Okay, so we'll look at the next slide. So now let's look at the Vedanta Matam from an Advaitic standpoint. The subject matter of Uttara Mimamsa or Vedanta is as old as time itself. So when we talk about Brahma Vidya, there is no beginning to it. So this is the subject matter of Uttara Mimamsa, which is what we call Vedanta. Historically, it found its clearest exposition in the Advaita Sampradaya, rejuvenated, not created, by Adi Shankaracharya through his unfolding of Shastra. So a lot of people are under the misconception that Adi Shankaracharya created Advaita, like he founded Advaita, which is not true. He was part of a never-ending parampara. It was beginningless. So he had a guru, his guru had a guru, and they all taught Advaita only. So let's note that Advaita does not have a beginning. But Shankaracharya was one of its clearest exponents. He wrote the Bhashyas on the Upanishads, he wrote it on the Brahma Sutra, on the Bhagavad Gita, he created many Prakarana Granthas and so on. So this is something to note. It is also worth mentioning that Vedanta has lent itself to two later days interpretations, namely Vishishta Dvaita and Dvaita, propounded by the commentaries of Sri Ramanujacharya and Sri Madhavacharya respectively. So these are two later day interpretations of Vedanta. And again, this is an Advaitic standpoint. The differences between these interpretations are purely ontological, though they share a common basis on all dharmic principles where we must unite. So, for the interest of our dharmic discussions over here, we're not really looking at the differences between Advaita, Vishishadvaita and so on. What we know is that we all follow dharma and we all have to come together under a common banner for the preservation and propagation of our dharmic ideals. So, but anyway, for the scope of this discussion and going forward, we'll be looking only at Advaita. So the skeptic is like, it's almost like peeling layers of an onion. So each one's revealing a new facet, right? And that's correct. We can go deeper than that as well. But it is important to walk through these iterations to do justice to the various layers of our identity. You have been most patient. The next page is where we'll put this all together and it will be most rewarding. So we've looked so far, and let's take a step back and just remember what we've gone through regarding the classifications. So first we looked at the global faith systems. Within that we looked at the dharmic faith systems, the Abrahamic ones and the miscellaneous ones. Within the dharmic faith systems, we looked at the ones which accept the Vedas, the Astikas, and the ones who don't accept the Vedas, who are called the Nastikas. Within these Indic darshanas again, we looked at Saishvara, the ones who accept Ishvara, and the ones who reject Ishvara. And then within that itself, we saw some like gradations and differences. And then we zoned into Uttara Mimamsa. Within Uttara Mimamsa, as we see here, there are three interpretations, but the Advaita is the one which we are catering to right now. So these are all the various layers of identity which we'll be putting together. So on the next slide. So, how do you really identify yourself? Like, for example, I've put my example over here, and in the next page we'll see somebody else's as well. So regionally, I'm Bharatiya, I'm Hindustani, I'm Indian. Culturally, I'm a Hindu, I'm Gujarati specifically. As part of the global faith systems, I adhere to the dharmic darshanas. Within the Indic dharmic darshanas, I adhere to the Vaidika, the Astika darshana, what we also call Hinduism today. My ontological view of Ishvara is that I accept Ishvara and therefore I'm Saishvara. The branch of Astika darshanas that I adhere to is Uttara Mimamsa or Vedanta. Within Vedanta, I accept the Advaita Matam. Within the Advaita Matam, I follow Vivarana teachings, and we'll see that there is Vivarana, there's Bhamanti, and a couple of other minor ones. The Guru Parampara that I follow is Sadashiva Samarambha. So the one that has begun from Ishvara himself, Sadashiva, or somebody may also say Narayana Samarambham, right? So this is again depending on your parampara. The sampradaya I follow are the Ekadandi Darshanami. So you'll see that Shankaracharya walks with the dandi, and there are many acharyas within our sannyasis within our parampara who carry a little bit of who are dressed in orange and who carry a stick with them, right? So these are the Ekadandi Darshanamis. The different Darshanamis you have like Saraswati, Giri, Puri, and so on. So the sub sampradaya that I follow is the Saraswati, who is my Kulaguru, my Acharya, Pujya Swami Dayanandaji. So he's my Kulguru, and he is a teacher of all of us here, or many of us here. The Kuladeva, my Kuladeva Srinathji from my dad's side, and Amba Mata from my mother's side. So I follow a combination of both. I don't really have one specific in my mind. My Kuladevi is Kodiyarma, and the Kula Sampradaya that I follow is Vaishnava, and now more or less I'm inclined towards Smarta tradition. My Gotra is Kashyap. So the reason I'm really listing this is that it's hard to classify ourselves from one using a single word. These are all the various identities that identify us culturally. And so if a person says, what are you? You say, okay, I'm an atheist or I'm a theist. It doesn't fit in here because there are so many gradations. There are so many nuances. There are so many differences that you cannot identify yourself using a single word, especially coming from the Western standpoint, from the Western perspective. So we have to learn to identify ourselves using the Indic standpoint. Sorry, I see Sundarji's question. What is pravara? I'm not aware of pravara, the word.
Three rishis. When you say Abhivadaye, you say pravara, right? So there are three rishis that you will normally invoke when you introduce yourself. For example, I'm Sankriti Gotra.
Okay.
And my pravara is Shaktya Sankritya Kaurivita. Traya Rishi. Okay, but I'll find out.
I see. I actually don't know my pravara. So
okay.
Now this gives me something to research. So thank you for that. And as you brought up, there can be more identities which you can even add to this list. Like you can add your Varna, you can add whatever you want. And yeah, thank you for that. And I'll probably ask you more questions about this going forward. So any questions here so far? And this is an incomplete list. There could be more things I could add. I just couldn't fit them all in here. So
can you explain more about Vivarna?
Okay. So there's one school of thought in Vedanta which is very popular, which is Vivarna, and this is followed by the Arsha Vidya Gurukulam as well. There's another school which is called Bhamati, and there's one commentator on the Brahma Sutras, and he was also an Advaitin as well, and his name was Vachispati Mishra, and so he wrote a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, and it is said that while he was writing a commentary there, his wife used to serve him very well every single day. Day and night he was involved in writing a commentary. She would bring him food, she would bring him his anushtanam items and so on. And she was such an ideal patni that he was very touched by the end of his commentary. And therefore he named it after her and he called it Bhamati. And this matam of Advaita after him was named Bhamati. So that is one interpretation of Advaita, which talks about several differences. For example, we say that the locus, and perhaps if I'm wrong about this, I'll come back and correct myself. But what I understand is that we say that the locus of avidya is Brahman, and then there I think the locus of avidya is the jiva. Another thing we say is that Shravanam is key, right? When you study the teachings of the Shastras, Shravanam, the listening, when that takes place, knowledge occurs. Whereas for the Bhamati school, they say that yes, Shravanam, Mananam, and Nidyasana are required for sure, but after that you also need to digest this knowledge in a different way, like in some sort of a meditation, some sort of contemplation. You need to make that knowledge ready in a digestible, assimilable form, and that is how one can gain jnana. So their take on knowledge and their take on avidya, and there are a few differences that are there between Vivarna and Bhamati. But the Vivarna one is the predominant school of Advaita Vedanta, and Arsha Vidya Gurukulam and many other paramparas usually follow Vivarna, and there are some who follow Bhamati as well. So this is the difference between the Advaita Matams. Any other questions? Okay, so I want to, Amitji.
Yeah, Prashant Bhai, I have a question here.
Yeah.
I particularly, a year back, I was not even sure about my Gotra. I never cared. maybe 2 years back, I never cared. I didn't even ask for my Kul Guru, my Kul Devta. And now, to build an identity, how do I explore that, and what's the way out?
So, this is a good question, and we all need to know our identity at a Vyavaharika level. There are different identities we have. One of them, as we saw, everything from regional to cultural to philosophical, these are all the identities steeped within our Indic traditions. So one way to really know about it, and something that I've learned, is to ask my elders. The elders in my family, you see, the mukhya, the buzurg people. So I did not know about Kodiyar Ma, but I had to actually ask my father, who had to get it from somebody else as well. So it's good to actually go back to your cultural moorings. It's good to keep a diary. It's good to have these things ready, because many times when you perform pujas and like yagnas, the pujari ji will also ask you that what is a gotra, what is a nakshatra, what is this, what is that. So it's good to have these things handy. I would say that look at your birth chart, look at your kundali, look at your nakshatra, look at your the house you're born under. These are like basic things that every Hindu should know at the tip of the tongue. I admit that I did not know all of these things as well, and I myself had to learn about it in due time. So if once we have a strong hold over our identity, then we cannot be defined on anybody else's terms. They will be on our own terms. You know what I mean? And it's impossible to get digested, because digestion can only take place when you dilute your categories, and after diluting your categories, you map it onto the westernized Abrahamic categories. So that is how dilution takes place. But once you become so strong in your own cultural identity, and you're able to define yourselves accurately on that level, then you'll always have that thing going for you, and you'll never be subject to identity crisis. So that is what I would suggest. Find out from your elders, find out from your kundali, just talk to your grandparents or whoever, and find out more about your heritage. It's the only way to really go about doing things.
Yes.
So I want somebody else to volunteer and try it themselves. Somebody who's not tried it. Okay, Shamu, you can go for it. Don't worry.
Okay. Regionally, I am Indian, or I think Kerala, from Kerala.
Sure.
Culturally and ethnically, I am sort of mixed. I have the Konkani Goan aspects and the Kerala aspects. Since my ancestors came to Kerala, we have actually a mixed tradition.
Okay.
Or mixed culture of both. Global faith system, Dharmika. Within Indic Darshanas, Vedanta. Ontological view on Ishvara, Sai Ishvara.
Yeah.
Branch of Astika Darshana, again Vedanta. Vedanta Madam, Advaita.
Okay, so let's look at one difference here. So within the Indic Darshanas, you are a Vaidika, right?
Yeah.
And then within the Astikas, then you are Vedanta. So you're Vaidika within it. Okay, go on.
And Guru Parambara, Narayana Samarambha, Ashvidya.
Yeah.
Sampradaya.
The same, the Ekadandi
Same. Sat Sampradaya, same. Kula Guru, same.
Yeah.
Kula Deva is Damodara and Kula Devi is Mahalakshmi.
Okay.
Kula Sampradaya is Madhva Sampradaya. Vaishnava is Madhva Sampradaya.
Okay.
Gotra is Kamshi. And my Pravara is Vishwamitra, starting from Vishwamitra Rishi. Chantra and Angvanshtam.
Very nice. Wonderful. So now I learned something new, the Pravara, which I will explore.
Yeah, we stayed by doing the, I think, Bhumi Prarthana.
Yeah.
In Sandhya.
Very nice. Oh, yeah, Shamu bhai, can you also type it out so that others can also take a look at what you wrote?
Sure.
Awesome. Great. So in the meanwhile, let's look at the next slide. And, I just want to put some closing thoughts. But before that, are there any commentaries, questions? Let's make those, and then we can close out slowly.
Yeah, actually, Prashantji, I wanted to say I actually don't know any of those, in fact, for myself. And we don't have a family pandit, and my parents are also not aware of these. and I don't have grandparents anymore. So how can I find out for myself?
I would say if you follow, at least you're studying Vedanta under a certain parampara, then you can fill those out, right? The Guru Parampara, the Sampradaya, the Sab Parampara, the Kula Guru. With regards to Kula Devi or Kula Deva, if you're sure that you don't know it, or if there's nothing that is, if there's no source you can go to in your family, if you have an Ishta Devta, like I think your Ishta Devta is Mataji or Shiva, right? So if you can use that as your Ishta Devta and you can pass it on to your children in the future. So, there might be many instances where, okay, let's take the instance of a person who may have converted to Islam during the Mughal era, but now he comes back to the Vedic traditions because, for whatever reasons, as a supposition that now he finds some meaning in the Vedas, then he himself will not have this whole list to create, right? And therefore he'll have to start somewhere. So I would say the best case is when you already have something going and you're like passing it on. But if not, then create something for yourself, because ultimately it's an identity you will give your children. You may not have it, but you can still give it for your children. You can create it for yourself. So you can have a Ishta Devta, you can have like a Guru Parampara that you follow. You can have an ontological view of Ishvara, right? So regionally, I think you're Punjabi.
Yeah,
Or you hail from Punjab. Culturally, ethnically, of course, you're like you're a Hindu, and whatever you speak Punjabi as a mother tongue. Global faith systems, you come under the dharmic ones. Within Indic Darshana, you come under the Astic ones, the Vedic ones. You accept Ishvara, so you're Ishvara. Yeah, so most of these things apply for you. Maybe something like Gotra or something, you can find out. Otherwise, it's not that important, I would say. If you're not able to, it's fine.
Okay.
But whatever you can fill, that's worth filling. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Just a comment here. If Gotra, if nobody knows, they usually come under Shiva Gotra. That's the common Gotra they all will come under. Suppose generally, even in my family, my father didn't know what his Gotra is because his father never told. So we all, whenever we go to the temple, they ask for Gotra, we say Shiva Gotra. Whoever's Gotra is not known, you can just come under Shiv Gotra.
Perfect. So that answers Gunjanji's question that if you don't have something, you always have a substitute for it, right? And this reminds me of something Swami Paramathanandaji said, that when you perform the Shraddha ceremony, it is what about parents whose children have died before them? Now there's nobody to perform Shraddha for them, right? And so we have this whole universal scheme where it's kind of like a mutual like a safety catch, where every person who's performing a Shraddha karma, some of it goes to the ones who don't have any children. And so it's kind of like a safety net we have in our parampara. And similarly, there's a safety net for Gotra also. If you don't have a Gotra, you can put Shiva Gotra. Or if you and there's a story in our Upanishads also about there's a person who he's asking his mother that what is my Gotra, and she says, sorry?
Satyakama Japala.
Yes, exactly. So he doesn't know his Gotra, and still his Acharya, usually when you go to an Acharya and you approach him for studies, they will ask you, okay, what is your Gotra? So Satyakama said, I'm sorry, I don't know my Gotra. All I know is that my mother is Jabala. Right? And the Acharya is touched. He's touched by the very fact that this person is determined, that he is approaching humbly, that he wants to gain this knowledge, that he has the Adhikaratvam. And so he teaches him. So I would say that you can create a substitute and you can create something new for yourself as well. Then so be it. Like Shiva Gotra, then Shiva Gotra. It works. But let this identity continue and pass it on. That's important. So let's look at some closing thoughts. As we saw earlier, within each darshana there are numerous branches. There are endless permutations and combinations over here. But we listed 12 mukhya darshanas within the Indic faiths. 72 were known in Bharat during Adi Shankaracharya's time, but the 12 ones were the major ones. There might be categories and subcategories. So it is always best to define ourselves using our own categories rather than blindly swallowing labels imposed from an outsider's perspective. So if somebody is asking you, are you an atheist? If somebody is asking you, are you a theist? Don't refuse that definition. Say that I do not classify as either. And then to say that you are Saishwara, say that you are Nireshwara, say that you are Astika or Nastika. Don't come under any definitions which don't apply perfectly to your situation. You have to speak from the Indic dharmic standpoint alone. So, we cannot list all, but there are so many schools of thoughts, from Shaktas to Shaivas, Kapalikas to Kaulas, Agoris to Tantrikas, Vaishnavas to Ganapatyas, and countless more. We are all part of a large Vedic family, and we have to be coherent in terms of dharma over here. Whatever philosophical differences are there are minute. What binds us together is this fabric, this reality framework of dharma. So this is something that we have to keep in mind always. And exactly, so what unites us together is a common dharmic framework. It is the bedrock of our Bharatiya civilization. It has informed our culture, traditions, music, dance, forms, architecture, philosophies, worship, ethics, attitudes, and everything else that you can think of. Ultimately, it has shaped our national ethos in a distinctly identifiable way. It is this dharmic framework, this dharmic culture. So, let's take a few moments to appreciate the breathtaking variety beautifully strung together by this unified thread of dharma. So, whether you come from the north or the south, whether your roots lie in the east or the west, that's a picture from a wedding, or if you decide to journey even further west than that. So this is when Swaminiji decided to grace our homes last month. Whether you are young or old, whether you are a competent student or a clear, capable teacher, whether you worship on land or offer tarpanam in the water, whether you are wise enough to bless the humble or humble enough to seek blessings from the wise. That's Pujya Swamiji blessing Narendra Modi ji. Whether you worship a given form or an animate being, whether your methods are widely practiced or uniquely unfamiliar, our means, expressions, languages, traditions may vary, but we are all connected to the same undeniable underlying truth. All of this is a manifestation of Ishvara. You are ever connected to the whole. You are the whole. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om.
That was